The most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one commanding attention or soaking up praise. It's the one who says little, watches everything, and holds their energy like a blade wrapped in velvet. While others scramble to be seen or heard, this person sits in stillness, not out of timidity, but because they've transcended the need for performance. There's a tension in their silence, not because they're hiding weakness, but because their strength is too deep to waste on display. You can feel it in the way they carry themselves, like someone who's made peace with chaos. They've already faced themselves, all the way down to the bone, and what came back from that confrontation wasn't louder. It was sharper and calmer. They don't enter a space to prove anything. Their presence alone is enough to shift the air. There's a density to them, a kind of weight that has nothing to do with words or posture. You can sense they've lost people, unlearned illusions, held heartbreak in their hands and still chose not to become bitter. They've sat through nights so long they forgot how to beg for light, and when the dawn came, they didn't celebrate. They just quietly kept going. They carry wisdom like scars beneath their skin, invisible, but felt by anyone who comes too close. Philosophy often praises the thinker who debates the loudest or writes the most, but overlooks the one who became wise without an audience. The empath belongs to this second category. Misread as soft, but in truth, tempered by fire. They don't speak much, not because they lack thoughts, but because they've learned how often language fails to hold what matters most. Their silence isn't absence, it's restraint. It's the decision to conserve energy for things that matter. And when they do speak, every word is deliberate. No waste. No effort to impress. Just truth, pure and clean. They're not unimpressed by the world, they're just no longer seduced by it. That's what makes them unshakable. They've watched the people they loved lie to them with kind eyes. They've been underestimated by those they would have once protected. And yet, they didn't close up. They refined. They got better at knowing who deserves access. They built inner gates. And now, they let very few through. This kind of quiet power unnerves people because it can't be manipulated. It's not reactive. It doesn't need validation. It's rooted in experience, in sleepless nights, in spiritual bruises. This is not someone who's fragile, they're focused. They know what they've survived. They remember every moment they gave too much and got too little. And they've chosen not to collapse under the weight, but to carry it with elegance. They no longer chase understanding from others. They no longer shrink to make others comfortable. They've seen too much to pretend anymore. They don't smile to be liked. They don't explain their silence. They just sit with it. And that stillness, it's sacred. It's a kind of strength most people will never understand, because it was built in the absence of applause, in the presence of pain, and through the brutal discipline of self-awareness. That is the kind of power that doesn't announce itself, but shifts everything when it enters the room. He grasped a truth both ancient and unsettling, that every person carries a split within, the version we offer to the world, and the one we bury beneath polite smiles. The empath doesn't avoid this inner divide, they live inside it. While others dodge discomfort, the empath steps into it fully, often carrying the weight of emotions that aren't even theirs. But this isn't some emotional flaw, it's a rite of passage. In the realm of deep thought and soul work, pain isn't just suffering, it's initiation. It's the fire that burns illusions and reveals the self beneath. There's a long-standing misconception woven into the fabric of society, that those who feel deeply must somehow be fragile. Emotional depth is too often mistaken for emotional instability. Quietness is read as indecision. Sensitivity as softness. But that's a shallow reading of something far more profound. What many overlook is what the great philosophers and thinkers across history understood clearly. Those who feel the most aren't broken, they are simply carrying a deeper reality than most people ever access. The empath doesn't suffer from excessive emotion, they hold an intelligence that exists outside conventional intellect. It's not the intelligence of calculation or cold analysis. It's the intelligence of awareness, perceptual acuity so sharp it can detect what logic misses entirely. While society worships the rational mind and calls detachment a virtue, it often forgets that wisdom without emotional depth becomes mechanical, disconnected, even dangerous. A mind that thinks without feeling can justify cruelty. But a heart that feels deeply can perceive truths no logic can reach. The empath isn't blind to reason, they simply see beyond it. Their insight comes not from textbooks or theories but from direct experience of the soul's terrain. They feel the undercurrent beneath people's words. They notice discomfort that no one voices. They spot patterns others deny. And this ability to sense, to truly sense, what's unspoken isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of mastery. Where others fear emotion as chaos, the empath moves through it like a seasoned traveler. They don't drown in feeling, they navigate it. They don't overreact, they overperceive. Their stillness isn't a void, it's a finely tuned radar. They may not always have the words, but they have the knowing. And in a world that rewards noise and overlooks nuance, that knowing is their quiet power. It's not the kind of strength that demands attention. It's the kind that doesn't need it. Carl Jung didn't believe the self was something waiting to be discovered like a hidden treasure. He believed it had to be built, painstakingly, deliberately, sometimes through fire. And the empath often begins that construction long before they're ready. Not by choice, but through a series of soul-level ruptures, betrayal that cuts deeper than words, loss that alters their inner architecture, and manipulation that shakes their sense of reality. But rather than collapse under the weight, they do something astonishing, they transmute it. The empath doesn't run from the wreckage. They gather it. They descend into the deepest caverns of their inner world, not looking for escape routes, but for blueprints. Where others shove their wounds into dark corners, the empath pulls up a chair and listens. They don't just confront their darkness, they make it speak. To them, the shadow is not a curse, it's a teacher. It holds the rejected parts of the self, the raw and untamed fragments that still pulse with truth. And instead of battling it, they begin the slow work of integration, fusing the parts they were told to hide with the ones they were taught to show. This is not a gentle process. It's violent, holy, and entirely necessary. The empath lives at the intersection of contradictions, soft yet fierce, open yet guarded, wounded yet wise. They're constantly walking that razor's edge between compassion and collapse, between loving others and not losing themselves. And every single day, they must resist the very real temptation to become the thing that once hurt them. As nature warned, the danger in confronting darkness is becoming it. The empath knows this better than anyone. They face cruelty without adopting it, witness manipulation without imitating it. And that choice, repeated again and again in silence, is what makes them different. Not that they've avoided pain, but that they've refused to be reshaped by it into something unrecognizable. Their path is not escape. It's transfiguration. They turn poison into wisdom, and wounds into weapons of clarity. Here's where the contradiction becomes almost poetic. The empath, to the untrained eye, seems gentle, perhaps even fragile. But beneath that softness lies a blade honed by experience. They forgive, yes, often faster than they should. But they don't forget. Not because they're keeping score, but because their soul records everything. Every imbalance. Every emotional transaction. Every time they poured themselves into someone who only came to drink, not to give. And this memory isn't born from resentment, it's born from clarity. It's what separates empathy from naivety. With each repeated betrayal, with every recycled apology, something within them sharpens. A deeper knowing begins to crystallize. Their mind doesn't just recall, it analyzes, stores, tracks patterns others would dismiss. Until suddenly, without fanfare, something fundamental shifts. That shift is not a reaction, it's an evolution. A psychological awakening. The beginning of what Carl Jung described as the emergence of the true self, not the projected image, not the socially accepted role, but the raw, unedited core. This transformation isn't loud or theatrical. It's subtle, philosophical, like a river carving stone over time. The empath doesn't become someone new. They become someone real. Their love, once scattered freely like light through glass, now moves with purpose. It becomes sacred, reserved, protected. Their kindness doesn't disappear. It narrows its path. No longer an open field, it becomes a garden with gates. This isn't a loss of compassion. It's its refinement. They begin to recognize that loving without boundaries is not a virtue, it's self-abandonment. And so, their empathy sharpens. Not into cruelty, but into discernment. It becomes a sword of selective grace, drawn only in spaces where it won't be dulled. What once was boundless generosity now carries structure. What once forgave blindly now sees with precision. And this shift isn't bitterness, it's balance. The empath doesn't grow cold, they grow conscious. They don't harden, they fortify. Their tenderness isn't erased. It's just no longer for everyone. It's guarded, not by fear, but by wisdom. Within Carl Jung's psychological map, every soul is destined to pass through a kind of inner death, a collapse of the false self before anything authentic can emerge. For the empath, this collapse doesn't come from failure or weakness. It comes from being too full of feeling in a world that demands numbness. It happens slowly, painfully, when their depth is misread, their openness exploited, their care mistaken for a flaw to be used. The world asks them to shrink, to feel less, to need less, and for a time, they might even try. But something within them refuses to disappear. And then, one day, quietly, they stop breaking and begin transforming. That rebirth is not loud. It doesn't announce itself, but those who once fed off their vulnerability will feel it first. Because the new version of the empath no longer dances to old patterns. They've seen the scripts, they've learned the roles, and they're done playing parts that diminish them. Their reactions, once emotional and raw, become intentional, sharpened by insight and discipline. They no longer move from pain, they move from knowing, from control. They begin to embody something close to a spiritual tactician, a philosopher of the inner world. Observing without absorbing, acting without defending, choosing without explaining. They no longer argue to be understood. They simply set boundaries and leave. Their voice doesn't rise, but their energy does. And it speaks louder than any words ever could. They stop pleading for decency and start requiring it. They no longer chase after those who leave. They pause. They turn. And they walk, deliberately, finally, with nothing held back. What they leave in their absence is not emptiness, it's a kind of reckoning. A void where manipulation once thrived, now stripped of its power. The empath doesn't grow cold. They become immune. They're not cruel, they're clear. Their heart is still open, but it's no longer a door without a lock. Their attention is still generous, but only where it is earned. What once made them easy to hurt now makes them impossible to fool. This is not the end of their empathy, it's the beginning of their sovereignty. This is the essence of what Carl Jung pointed to when he spoke of true inner power, not through denial, but through integration. It isn't about cutting off the parts of ourselves that feel inconvenient or dark, it's about turning toward them, facing them without flinching, and learning to listen. For the empath, this shift is everything. Their suffering is no longer something to be healed away or silenced. It becomes a compass, a signal, a message written in ache. And the more they lean into it, the more whole they become. Not softer, not smaller, but more rooted, more precise. They stop reacting to pain like it's a threat. They begin to respond to it like it's data. The chaos that once overwhelmed them becomes something they can read like a map. Eventually, they stop playing the game entirely. The one where emotions are weaponized, where manipulation thrives on confusion and guilt. The empath exits the arena. They don't shout. They reflect. And that reflection, raw, clean, unfiltered, becomes a mirror no one can hide from. They don't twist reality. They expose it. And those who once relied on their uncertainty, the liars, the gaslighters, the emotional thieves, can no longer feed. Because the empath isn't disoriented anymore. They're lucid. And in that clarity, every mask begins to fall. Not with a fight, but with silence. The empath no longer needs to defend their truth. They just live it. This is what makes them dangerous, not in the way of destruction, but in the way of revelation. Their presence alone becomes confrontation. They don't dismantle toxicity with rage. They render it powerless by refusing to participate. They no longer carry what was never theirs to begin with. They no longer rescue what doesn't want to be saved. And without confusion to feed on, the manipulator starves. Not because the empath attacks, but because they've become too aware to be deceived. The transformation is complete when the empath stops trying to be good in the eyes of others and starts honoring the fullness of who they are. Not just their kindness, but their edges, their limits, their sacred the traits they were taught to repress: assertiveness, directness, self-preservation, return, not in aggression, but in balance. What was once hidden becomes integrated. And with that integration, the empath doesn't become someone else. They become undivided. They become real. And once someone reaches that state, radically whole, deeply awake, there's no going back. That's not healing. That's evolution. That's the kind of presence no illusion can survive. They no longer cast themselves into other people's storms. They no longer bleed for those who only see them as a source, not a soul. Their empathy, once sprawling and unfiltered, now flows with purpose. No longer a flood, it's a force. Controlled, centered, earned. They no longer perform for love or contort themselves to be accepted. They arrive whole, unmasked, and untamed. Where once their spirit was a revolving door, it's now sacred space. Entry is no longer assumed, it's chosen. This is what Carl Jung called the final return, not to who they were told to be, but to who they truly are. Not a patchwork of approval-seeking roles, but a solid, radiant core. They move now from inner truth, not outer fear. The tactics of manipulation, confusion, guilt, chaos, no longer land. The empath has stepped into clarity so sharp, it exposes everything false without lifting a finger. They no longer chase meaning, they become it. Not to dominate, but to embody. Still, quiet, unshakable. And to those who once mistook their softness for weakness, there is no greater shock than the strength of someone who's no longer afraid to be seen. This isn't where their story ends, it's where it truly begins. The evolved empath isn't delicate, they're deliberate. Not innocent, but illuminated. They've learned to fuse kindness with strength, to hold compassion without surrendering themselves. They no longer beg for harmony, they embody it. And not the fragile peace that fears conflict, but the grounded kind that silences chaos with presence alone. So when you meet someone soft-spoken and sincere, don't mistake them for someone untested. You might be looking at a soul that's been shattered and rebuilt more times than they can count. And what they've etched into themselves through every fall and rise is this: real love never asks you to disappear. It demands that you remember who you are. That's not just empathy. That's self-mastery. And that is why they can no longer be touched.